Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The valley trembled with sound. Hooves struck the frozen ground in rhythm, bridles clinking, breath turning to steam. Ahead, the guns waited, rows of Russian cannon glinting under a pale sun. The Light Brigade had no orders worth trusting, only a gesture lost in the roar. Yet they rode, 600 men galloping into the mouth of steel and smoke, and into legend. For 20 minutes, the world held its breath. The thunder of hooves met the thunder of guns. Shells screamed overhead. Shrapnel tore through flesh and fabric alike. Horses reared, men vanished in flashes of white and red. And still the line held, charging not toward victory, but into eternity. When the smoke lifted, the valley lay quiet again, littered with the broken and the brave. Silence was the only survivor. Far behind that chaos, the war itself had already begun unraveling. The Crimean War, an empire's gamble dressed as holy duty. Britain and France had come to aid the faltering Ottomans against Russia's advance, but faith was only the costume. Pride was the weapon. In the corridors of Europe's power, the talk was not of salvation, but of balance. How much ambition one empire could claim before the others moved to stop it. Russia had long sought the Black Sea's warm waters, a gateway to the Mediterranean. The Ottomans, once masters of continents, were crumbling. To the Tsar, the empire looked like an old lion ready for the taking. To Britain and France, it looked like a battlefield waiting to happen. And so, when a quarrel over Christian shrines in Jerusalem spiraled into a diplomatic feud, the spark found its tinder. France, under Napoleon III, declared itself the protector of Catholics in the Holy Land. Russia, defender of the Orthodox faith, saw insult and opportunity in equal measure. Religion became a flag, faith twisted into the language of conquest. In palaces from Paris to St. Petersburg, men invoked God while counting borders. By 1853, the Tsar's armies crossed the Prut River into Ottoman lands. The guns spoke first in the Balkans, and soon the war began to feed on its own confusion. Orders delayed, intentions misread, alliances forged from fear. Empires stumbled into the fire as if sleepwalking, one by one, pulled by pride and inertia. The Light Brigade's charge would come later, a symbol of everything the war would become. Courage without clarity, valor chained to misunderstanding. The valley they rode into was not just a field in Crimea, it was Europe itself, charging blindly toward the future. The wind fell silent after the last cannon fired. In that stillness, a truth lingered. No one yet knew what the war was for, only that it had already gone too far. The Crimean War began not in thunder, but in pride. In palaces and embassies, men in silken medals mistook vanity for vision. Tsar Nicholas I believed himself chosen to finish what Peter the Great had begun, to open Russia's frozen empire to warm seas and southern glory. In his mind, the Ottoman Empire was already a corpse, and he was merely arranging its funeral. Yet Europe still watched him with suspicion. Britain feared Russian ships in the Mediterranean. France feared Russian influence over the Church. Even Austria, his supposed ally, whispered of neutrality. Still, Nicholas pressed forward, convinced that history favored the bold. His confidence was his armor, and his weakness. In 1853, Russian troops marched into the Ottoman provinces of Moldavia and Wallachia. Columns of men in gray overcoats crossed the Prut River, their boots sinking into the thawing mud. Priests blessed them with holy water, icons raised against the rain. "We fight for faith," they said. But faith was a mask. Ambition was the face beneath. The Tsar sought not salvation, but control of the Black Sea, the crossroads between Europe and Asia. In Constantinople, panic rippled through the Ottoman court. Sultan Abdul-Majid I, young and cautious, turned to the West for help. His generals promised loyalty. His advisors promised strategy, but all they had were hopes and foreign loans. When the Russian columns advanced, the Ottomans answered with declarations and drums. The first blood came at Oltenitsa, where Ottoman and Russian troops met across the Danube in November. The guns cracked, the river echoed, and smoke rolled over both shores. The fight ended with no clear victor, only bodies drifting downstream. It was a prelude, a whisper of what was coming. Nicholas expected Austria to applaud his holy mission. Instead, Vienna grew cold. Its diplomats warned him that Europe would not tolerate the fall of the Ottoman Empire. But Nicholas heard what he wanted to hear. They will not act, he told his generals. They fear me more than they pity the Turk. He was wrong. Far from the battlefields, another empire stirred. France, led by Napoleon III, sought prestige to match its ambition. The young emperor saw Russia's aggression as a stage upon which to prove France's greatness once again. Britain, unwilling to let France act alone, joined the chorus. Old enemies would now march as uneasy allies, their unity forged not by friendship, but by rivalry. The storm was gathering. Diplomacy turned to threats, and threats to mobilization. By the spring of 1854, the pieces were in motion. Russia stood alone, facing three empires in a world that had decided pride was no longer enough. In the streets of St. Petersburg, posters called the war a crusade. In London, it was hailed as justice. In Paris, as glory. But on the fields of the Balkans, the wind carried only one sound: the drums of men marching to die for words they would never understand. By the summer of 1854, Europe had crossed the line between warning and war. Diplomats packed their papers, telegraphs hummed, and the armies began to move. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas watched the smoke rise from the southern front and told his advisors, "We will strike them down like snow before spring." But the snow melted into mud, and his words soon followed. France and Britain declared war in March. Their fleets gathered in the Mediterranean, sails snapping in the cold wind as thousands of soldiers crowded the decks. The men cheered, but few knew where they were bound. Propaganda painted the war as righteous, a defense of civilization against barbarism, but beneath the music and banners, fear traveled quietly. In the Black Sea, the Russians struck first. Their fleet cornered an Ottoman squadron at Sinope, and the sky filled with fire. Explosive shells, new, merciless weapons, tore through wooden hulls, turning ships into furnaces. More than 3,000 Ottoman sailors died in a single afternoon. From Constantinople to London, the name Sinope became a curse. It was not a battle. It was a warning. When word reached Paris, Napoleon III seized the moment. "We cannot let the Tsar decide the balance of the world," he declared. The British agreed. Pride had found its purpose. The Allies would bring the war to Russia itself. In September 1854, a combined army of 60,000 British, French, and Ottoman troops landed on the Crimean coast near Eupatoria. The sea was rough, the landing chaotic. Waves smashing into boats, crates lost, men slipping on wet sand. The air reeked of salt and sweat and confusion. A French officer wrote, "We arrived not as conquerors, but as castaways." Yet somehow, the army assembled. Their target, Sevastopol, Russia's fortress on the Black Sea. Before reaching the city, the Allies met their first great trial, the Battle of Alma. On September 20th, under a blazing sun, the armies faced each other across a river valley flanked by steep ridges. The Russians held the high ground, cannons lined along the crest. The Allies advanced uphill through mud and grape shot, drums beating through the roar of artillery. For hours, the ridge became a furnace of smoke and noise. Men climbed through the chaos, shouting orders no one could hear. The air was thick with dust and the metallic tang of blood. The French flanked the Russian left, while the British stormed the center. By afternoon, the Russian line broke, their flag falling amid shattered guns. The Allies had won, but the price was steep. When the firing stopped, the river ran red. A British surgeon wrote, "The living cried for water, and the dying for silence." The stench of powder mixed with that of burning uniforms. Even victory smelled like death. The path to Sevastopol was open, but the Allies hesitated, exhausted, uncertain. Their triumph at Alma had shown their courage, but also their confusion. No one could agree on the next step. Some urged a direct assault, others a siege. The generals argued as the wounded groaned beneath the same sun. The war, like the men who fought it, was now limping forward, one step, one mistake at a time. The victory at Alma should have opened the road to Sevastopol. Instead, it revealed how little the Allies understood the war they were fighting. The generals, British, French, and Ottoman, met in crowded tents, maps spread across tables slick with sweat and dust. They argued over direction, supply, and glory. While they talked, the Russians moved. A direct march on Sevastopol could have ended the war in a month. Instead, the Allies chose caution, circling wide to approach from the south. The detour cost them 2 precious weeks. Those days gave the Russians time to turn Sevastopol into a fortress. Civilians, sailors, and soldiers worked side by side, digging trenches and mounting cannon on the hills. Day and night, the sound of hammers echoed across the bay, metal against stone, determination against despair. When the Allies finally reached the city, they found not a crumbling port, but a beast surrounded by claws of earth and fire. Sevastopol bristled with guns, hundreds of them, commanding every ridge and valley. Behind its walls, Russian engineers under Admiral Kornilov prepared for a siege. The Black Sea Fleet, unable to face the enemy at sea, was scuttled in the harbor to block entry. Masts rose from the water like a forest of drowned trees. The Allies camped along the ridges to the south, building their own lines under constant fire. At night, the air pulsed with the rhythm of artillery, the slow, heart-like thud of distant guns. The men dug trenches through chalk and clay, their fingers raw, their boots rotting from mud. The smell of smoke and sickness hung heavy, and the whine of shells never stopped. October brought the first great test, the Battle of Balaclava. The Russians, seeking to break the siege, struck first, 25,000 men descending upon the Allied supply lines. The morning fog clung to the hills, muffling movement. Ottoman troops held the first line on the causeway heights, but were overwhelmed, their defenses collapsing under the weight of cavalry. Then came the British Thin Red Line, a mere 2 ranks of Highland infantry standing against the charge. They fired, reloaded, and fired again, turning the assault into slaughter. The line held, but victory dissolved into confusion. Orders misheard, signals lost in the smoke. From a distant hill, commanders watched through spyglasses as one mistake unraveled into disaster. The Light Brigade, those 600 horsemen of legend, received the wrong command. Instead of pursuing a retreating enemy, they were sent headlong into the valley of Russian guns. What followed was not battle, but ritual. Hooves pounded, shells shrieked, men disappeared in flashes of fire and dirt. A French officer watching from afar whispered, "C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre." Magnificent, but it is not war. When it ended, half the brigade was gone. Horses screamed in the smoke, and the valley stank of blood and powder. A British private wrote home, "The sky itself seemed to fall upon us." In London, the newspapers called it heroism. The soldiers called it what it was, madness. The charge of the Light Brigade became a symbol, a myth of courage carved from error. Yet beneath the poetry and glory, a darker truth grew. The same confusion that doomed those 600 now threatened the entire campaign. In Sevastopol, the Russian guns fell silent for the night. The sea lapped against the sunken ships. And in the cold trenches to the south, men stared into the dark, listening to the wind drag smoke across the bay, wondering who would survive the dawn. The echoes of Balaclava lingered long after the guns fell silent. Across the hills, the cries of wounded horses faded into the night wind. What had been meant as triumph became a dirge. Commanders searched for words, soldiers searched for meaning, and the valley where the Light Brigade fell turned to legend even before the bodies were buried. But the war did not pause for mourning. The Allies tightened their grip around Sevastopol, determined to end the siege before winter. Their trenches crept closer to the city walls, lines of earth and desperation illuminated by the glow of cannon fire. The smell of sulfur and sweat filled the air. "We live between thunder and silence," a French soldier wrote. The Russians struck back in November at Inkerman. Dawn came hidden under a heavy fog. The hills above the British camp were shrouded in gray, and from that gray came movement, thousands of Russian soldiers advancing in near silence. The British barely had time to load their rifles before the mist erupted in flashes of fire. Muskets cracked, bayonets clashed, and screams vanished into the fog. It was chaos. Officers shouted orders no one could hear. Regiments fought blind, guided only by instinct. The mud beneath their boots turned red and slick. A British captain described it simply. "We fought men we could not see for reasons none could explain." The battle raged for hours. On Home Ridge, the British 2nd Division, just a few thousand men, held off 10 times their number. When ammunition ran low, they fought with bayonets, rocks, even fists. A French brigade arrived just as the line was about to collapse, their drums echoing through the smoke like a heartbeat returning to a dying body. Together, they pushed the Russians back. By midday, the fog began to lift, revealing what the battle had cost. The hills were littered with corpses. The dead lay so thick that one could walk from trench to trench without touching the ground. A British officer wrote, "The field looked like it had been plowed with men." The victory at Inkerman saved the siege, but it broke the army that won it. When night came, the guns fell silent, but the moans did not. The fog returned, swallowing the ridge once more. Lanterns moved through the haze like lost souls searching for one another. Somewhere beyond the lines, the church bells of Sevastopol rang faintly, as if tolling for both sides. Winter was coming. The ground was already hard beneath their boots. The men had won the ridge, but lost their warmth, their strength, their faith. Inkerman was over, but the worst was still ahead. The valley slept under a pale moon, its soil soaked with blood and frost. The wind whispered through the trenches, carrying no orders, no hope, only the sound of the living trying to remember how to breathe. Winter came to Crimea like a slow executioner. The first snow fell in November, soft and silent, masking the dead and the dying. Then the wind arrived, cold, sharp, and endless. It howled through the trenches, tearing at the frozen canvas of tents. The soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, their breath turning to frost. "We feared not the Russians," one wrote, "but the wind." The siege had stopped moving. The guns still roared by day, but the ground no longer changed hands. Only the seasons did. Mud turned to ice, rivers to mirrors, and hope to memory. Supply ships sank in the storms that raged across the Black Sea. Those that reached the shore found no roads, only frozen cliffs and starving men. Horses collapsed from hunger, their bodies used as barricades. Food ran out. So did firewood. Inside the camps, disease ruled. Cholera, dysentery, frostbite, each took its turn. Men coughed themselves to death in their sleep. In the hospitals of Balaclava, the air stank of blood, rot, and opium. The cries of the wounded echoed down the corridors until they became part of the wind itself. Doctors worked with hands cracked from cold, their instruments freezing to the touch. This was the winter that made Florence Nightingale a legend. By lamplight, she walked the rows of the dying, her shadow stretching across the walls like a cross. She brought order to chaos, clean water, fresh bandages, and mercy. "She is the only light in this place of shadows," a soldier whispered. Her reforms would change medicine forever, but in those months she fought a battle not against Russia, but against time and neglect. In Sevastopol, the Russians suffered too. They were trapped behind their walls, starving under the same sky. Civilians burned furniture for warmth. Soldiers shared bread hardened to stone. The boom of cannon had become a comfort, proof that someone, somewhere, still had the strength to fight. December storms grew worse. One night a gale tore through the harbor, wrecking 30 Allied ships and drowning hundreds of men. Supplies vanished into the sea. The survivors crawled onto shore, shivering and silent. The campfires that remained burned low, smoke curling upward like faint prayers that never reached heaven. Letters home spoke little of glory now. "We came as soldiers," one wrote, "and have become ghosts who breathe." The frost glittered on bayonets, beautiful and cruel. Between battles, men sat in silence, staring at the horizon where nothing moved. Not the enemy, not the hope of spring. By the turn of the year, the Crimea had become a graveyard without walls. The war had stopped being about territory or pride. It had become a test of endurance, fought not between empires, but between men in the cold. And in that frozen stillness, where wind howled louder than any cannon, the war found its truest voice, the sound of silence after everything else had died away. When the spring thaw came in 1855, it did not bring relief, only mud. The snow melted into filth and rot, flooding trenches filled with corpses and broken muskets. The air stank of decay. Sevastopol, still under siege, looked less like a city and more like a wound that refused to heal. From the hills above, the Allied soldiers could see it all: the shattered port, the blackened domes, the harbor choked with the mass of sunken ships. The Russians had scuttled their fleet to block the bay, and the water still shimmered with oil and smoke. Each sunrise brought new bombardment. The thunder of cannon rolled like an unending drumbeat. Dust rose in great clouds that hung over the city for hours. "It rained ash instead of snow," one Frenchman wrote. Inside Sevastopol, the Russians refused to die quietly. Men, women, and children labored together to rebuild the defenses each night, shovels clanging against the stone. Church bells were melted into cannon, iron gates turned into barricades. Every street became a trench, every house a fortress. Admiral Nakhimov, calm, grim, and sleepless, walked the ramparts daily, greeting his soldiers by name. "We will hold until we are dust," he told them, and they believed him. The Allies tried to match that resolve with fire. British and French guns, hundreds of them, opened up day after day, turning the hills into firestorms. The earth shook beneath their own boots. "It was as if the sky itself had split open," a British sergeant recalled. Yet for every bombardment, the Russians replied. Smoke became the weather of war. At night, the battlefield glowed orange against the horizon. The cries of the wounded carried on the wind. The soldiers dug by moonlight, their shovels striking frozen ground with dull rhythm. Between barrages, there were moments of eerie calm when even the seagulls dared not fly over the bay. That silence was worse than the cannon. It meant the next storm was coming. In the Allied camps, rumor became another enemy. The generals quarreled, supplies dwindled, morale sagged. "We live in circles," a British officer wrote. "We dig, we fire, we bury. Then we dig again." The French were losing patience with the British with their allies, and everyone with the war itself. But none dared retreat, not after so much blood. Pride kept them fighting when reason could not. By May, both sides were trapped in a rhythm of exhaustion. Assault, bombardment, reprieve, repeat. The front lines barely shifted, yet thousands died for every few yards gained. The war had slowed to a crawl, but death had not. And through it all, Sevastopol stood. Its skyline was now jagged and skeletal, its streets half gone, but the Russian flag still flew above the Balaclava bastion. From the sea, it looked almost peaceful, until you listened. Beneath the waves of the Black Sea, the sunken ships groaned with the tide, as if mourning the city that refused to drown. By the summer of 1855, the siege had become an endless heartbeat, gunfire by day, silence by night, and death in between. The heat replaced the frost, but misery stayed. Flies swarmed over the camps, water turned foul. The soldiers lived among the dead, their uniforms stiff with sweat and dirt. "We rot in sunlight now," one British corporal wrote. "The cold has gone, but it left its ghost behind." The Allies pressed harder. New guns arrived by sea, massive mortars that hurled shells the size of barrels. They called it the Great Bombardment. From the hills south of Sevastopol, hundreds of cannons fired in unison. The ground shook, the air shimmered with smoke. For days, the roar never ceased. The city below was consumed in a haze of dust and flame. Church domes crumbled, walls vanished, and the harbor boiled under exploding shells. In the chaos, the Russians answered with fire of their own. They had less ammunition but more resolve. The gunners at the Balaclava bastion stood bare-chested in the smoke, loading until their hands bled. When one fell, another stepped forward. Admiral Nakhimov himself stood among them, his voice cutting through the thunder, until a sniper's bullet struck him down. He died where he stood, his face calm, his cap still in place. The defenders buried him under fire. "The earth itself trembled as if it wept," one sailor wrote. To the Allies, the admiral's death was a sign of weakness. To the Russians, it was a vow. Sevastopol would not fall quietly. The siege turned savage. Nights glowed red along the ridges as soldiers crept through trenches, stabbing and clawing for ground. Sometimes they fought hand-to-hand in silence, bayonets flashing in the dark. Other times they simply listened to each other breathe across the lines, too tired to hate. Disease remained the greater killer. The hospitals at Balaclava overflowed again, the air thick with the stench of sweat and iodine. "We bury men before we can remember their names," a nurse wrote. Horses collapsed under wagons of cannonballs, left where they fell. The flies feasted on everything. Even the crows abandoned the field. There was nothing left to eat. By August, both sides were running out of men, but not out of orders. The French took the lead, pushing toward the Balaclava bastion in the hope of ending it all. One more assault, their generals promised. But promises had lost their meaning. Every day looked like the last. A world reduced to gunfire, mud, and the metallic taste of smoke. From the sea, the ships continued their rhythm. Boom, pause, boom again. The echo rolled across the peninsula like distant thunder. When the wind shifted, it carried with it the faint sound of singing from within Sevastopol's walls. Russian soldiers, their faces black with soot, sang hymns between the barrages. The Allies listened from their trenches. The songs rose and fell with the cannon fire. And for a brief moment, even the dying stopped to listen. Two armies, one sound, the music of endurance. September 1855. After a year of siege, the end was close enough to smell. Smoke, salt, and rot thick in the air. The guns had pounded Sevastopol day and night for a week. The hills glowed red under constant bombardment. The Balaclava bastion, the city's heart, was now a mountain of shattered stone. Every explosion tore new wounds into a landscape already beyond recognition. On the morning of September 8th, the French attacked first. Drums rolled through the haze, followed by the cry, "En avant," and thousands surged forward into the smoke. The air itself seemed to burn. Cannonballs carved through ranks of men. Musket fire rattled from the walls, and the earth trembled under the weight of men and metal. For 3 hours, the bastion became a furnace. When the French finally reached the walls, they fought hand to hand among the ruins. Shovels, rifles, even bare fists. There was no air left to breathe, one survivor wrote, only dust, screams, and the taste of blood. The Russian defenders refused to yield. Their officers died where they stood, sabers drawn. They fought until their ammunition was gone, then hurled stones. By afternoon, the French tricolor flew above the Balaclava. Sevastopol's heart had been cut out, but the city refused to die. Across the bay, British troops stormed the Redon fort. Their assault faltered under the weight of crossfire. The attack dissolved into chaos, officers shouting, men falling, smoke swallowing all sense of direction. By sunset, the British withdrew, leaving the French alone amid victory's ruins. That night, the Russians made their choice. Under cover of darkness, they began to retreat across the bay to the northern shore. Fires lit the skyline as they destroyed what they could not save: ammunition stores, ships, entire neighborhoods. The crack of collapsing walls echoed across the water. One witness wrote, "The city burned, but no one screamed. It was as if the stones themselves were saying goodbye." At dawn, Sevastopol was silent. The Allies entered through clouds of ash and dust. Streets were unrecognizable, piles of brick, twisted iron, and the smell of powder that would never leave. A French officer wrote, "We took not a city, but a graveyard." Even the victors spoke softly, their boots crunching over glass and bone. The Russian flag still flew from the northern heights across the bay, a reminder that even in defeat, they had not surrendered. The siege was over, but the war refused to die. In the Allied camps, bells rang and cannons fired in salute. Yet no one cheered. The soldiers stared at the ruins, at the smoke curling into the morning light. They had captured Sevastopol, but not the reason for the war. That night, the sea was calm for the first time in months. The wind carried no sound of guns, only the faint hiss of waves against the burned shore. A British soldier wrote, "We have conquered ashes, and in them, ourselves." The war's bloodiest chapter had ended, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the gunfire it replaced. The fall of Sevastopol did not end the war. It merely left it gasping. The city smoldered under a gray sky, its ruins hissing where rain met embers. Smoke drifted out to sea, mingling with fog. For the men who survived, victory felt like exile. "We stand in the wreck of our own creation," one officer wrote. Winter returned, cruel as memory. The trenches filled with water, the roads with corpses. Men no longer spoke of strategy or glory. They spoke of getting home. And in Europe's capitals, patience cracked. The war had become a mirror. Each empire saw in it its own exhaustion. In London, outrage boiled. Newspapers printed the names of the dead and demanded to know why. Parliament thundered. The public, once drunk on patriotism, now sobered by loss, turned on its leaders. "Our soldiers perish not by the sword, but by neglect," cried the Times. The government fell. Out of the chaos rose Lord Palmerston, a man who promised not peace, but competence. "The dead shall not have died in vain," he swore. The words echoed hollowly across the Channel. In Russia, the news struck like a funeral bell. Tsar Nicholas, his armies shattered, his dream undone, grew pale and silent. In March 1855, he died. Some said of pneumonia, others of despair. His final words, "Tell them I die loving my country." His son, Alexander II, inherited a broken empire and a bleeding army. He wanted peace, but pride demanded defiance. On the front, the war dragged on, senseless and automatic. Orders came without reason. Men marched without direction. By day, the guns roared. By night, the wounded cried into the wind. The Crimea had become a theater with no audience, only survivors performing for ghosts. Then came an act of madness wrapped in brilliance: the railway. British engineers, mud to their knees, built the Grand Crimean Central Railway from Balaclava to the front. Iron met earth, and for the first time the army moved faster than despair. Ammunition, food, and hope traveled along its tracks. The whistle of locomotives cut through cannon fire like a new kind of hymn. But even steel could not conquer disease. Cholera and fever still claimed more lives than bullets. In February 1855, the Russians launched one last desperate assault at Eupatoria. Their infantry advanced through fog, drums beating, banners snapping in the wind. For 3 hours, the plain became a cauldron of gunfire. The Ottoman defenders, backed by French artillery, repelled every wave. When it was over, the field was empty except for the dead. The attack had accomplished nothing. The storm that had frozen the world had finally begun to break, but not in triumph. The snow melted into mud once again, and in that mud lay a truth too bitter to speak. The war was ending not with a bang, but with erosion. On the cliffs above Sevastopol, a lone British sentry watched the horizon. The sea was calm, the air still. He could hear only the faint groan of the ships at anchor and the whisper of wind through the broken cannon. Somewhere far behind him, in the corridors of power, men were beginning to talk of peace. But on that frozen shore, no one believed them. By the winter of 1855, the war had burned itself down to embers. The trenches outside Sevastopol lay half empty, filled with snow and silence. Men who had once cheered for their flags now moved like shadows, their breath white against the dark. The guns still fired, but more out of habit than hatred, like a dying heart that refused to stop beating. The camps had become graveyards. Frost covered the dead in neat white shrouds. "We sleep beside our ghosts," a French soldier wrote. Disease was everywhere: cholera, dysentery, fever, each taking what the bullets had missed. When food arrived, it came moldy. When clothes came, they came too late. The cold crept into bone and memory alike. In that despair, a strange fraternity grew among enemies. Across the trenches, soldiers called to each other in broken words, trading cigarettes and laughter through the dark. A British corporal recalled tossing a tin of meat to a Russian sentry, who tossed back a crust of black bread. For a moment, war had remembered its own absurdity. But the cannons always returned. The siege guns fired through the snow, their thunder rolling over the bay. The smoke hung low, heavy, and gray. In the ruined harbor, frozen ships groaned with each gust of wind. The Black Sea itself seemed tired, its waves breaking softly, as if afraid to disturb the dead. The generals pretended the war still had meaning. Orders arrived like echoes, hollow and late. Men dug new trenches that no one would use. The French and British armies, their numbers thinned by disease, waited for spring that promised no glory. "We have conquered death," one officer wrote bitterly, "but not our own stupidity." In Sevastopol's ruins, the Russians endured the same misery. The new Tsar, Alexander II, had vowed to hold the city's northern shore. His men huddled in cellars, gnawing on frozen bread. They had no ammunition left to waste, but still fired when they could, if only to prove they were alive. One night, as snow fell over the bay, a Russian bugler played a slow hymn. No one fired. Both sides listened until the last note faded into the wind. When the weather broke in March, it carried not the scent of spring, but of peace. Rumors spread faster than bullets. The diplomats were meeting in Paris. The war might finally end. Yet in the Crimea, the soldiers did not celebrate. "We have no peace to sign," a British private muttered. "Only silence." The final shots came without ceremony, an exchange of cannon fire that echoed off the cliffs, more gesture than battle. The smoke cleared. The guns fell still. And for the first time in 18 months, the wind carried no thunder. That night, a pale moon hung over the bay. The city slept in ruins. The soldiers, British, French, Russian, Ottoman, slept among the ashes of what they'd built and broken. The war had not ended with victory or defeat. It had ended with exhaustion. And in that silence, so complete it seemed unnatural, even the sea forgot how to move. In March of 1856, The war that had consumed Europe at last came to a table. The guns were silent, but the world still trembled. Diplomats from every great power gathered in Paris, beneath chandeliers and mirrored ceilings, to decide what the slaughter had meant. The smell of ink replaced the stench of powder. The scratching of quills replaced the roar of cannon. It was a strange kind of victory. France, Britain, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia faced a humbled Russia, its generals disgraced, its fleet destroyed, its pride wounded, but not dead. The new Tsar, Alexander II, had sent word that he would seek peace, not glory. His father's empire had bled enough. "We fought the century's last war of kings," one observer noted, "and it has killed the kings themselves." On March 30th, 1856, the Treaty of Paris was signed. The sound of the pen, a quill scratching across parchment, was soft, almost fragile, yet it carried further than cannon fire. The treaty restored what the war had broken, or at least pretended to. Russia gave back conquered lands, and the Black Sea was declared neutral. No warships, no fortresses, only silence. The Orthodox Church reclaimed its holy sites, the Ottomans their borders, and Europe its illusion of balance. But the ink hid what no treaty could erase. Behind every clause were graves, 165,000 Allied dead, 130,000 Russians, and uncounted civilians. For every man who lived to see peace, another had vanished into the mud of Crimea. The diplomats spoke of honor and stability. The survivors thought only of the screams that would not leave their dreams. In London and Paris, bells rang. Flags were raised. The crowds cheered. But in the hospitals of Scutari, where Florence Nightingale still walked the dim corridors, the cheers sounded hollow. She had seen what Europe preferred to forget: gangrene, fever, hunger, and the quiet eyes of men who had stopped hoping. "We have made peace," she wrote, "but not sense." For Russia, the humiliation cut deep. Its Black Sea fleet, its window to the south, was gone. Yet defeat did not break the empire. It hardened it. Alexander II looked at the ashes of Sevastopol and swore that Russia would rise again, not through conquest but through change. He abolished serfdom, built railroads, expanded schools, and vowed to modernize the army. The empire would no longer be dragged forward by pride, but by necessity. In Britain and France, too, the war left scars. The public demanded reform of medicine, logistics, and leadership. "Never again," they said, though history would prove otherwise. In time, the Crimean War became a lesson written in blood, a warning ignored as soon as it was understood. When the delegates left Paris, the streets outside were quiet. A light rain fell, washing the ink from the carriage wheels. The war was over, but the century it had shaped was only beginning. And far away, on the cliffs of Crimea, the wind still whispered through the broken walls of Sevastopol, soft, steady, unending. The echoes of cannon had faded, but the silence they left behind was the same sound the diplomats mistook for peace. When the guns fell silent, the echoes did not. They lingered, in the trenches, in the hospitals, in the hearts of the men who had survived. The Crimean War had ended on paper, but not in the world. Across Europe, people searched for meaning in the ruins of a war that had achieved nothing yet changed everything. In Britain, the reports of suffering had already reached every home. The new weapon was not a rifle, but the press. Newspapers carried stories straight from the front, their ink wet with blood and disbelief. William Howard Russell of The Times became the world's first war correspondent, describing the misery and detail that polite society had never seen. He wrote of men without boots, of amputations done with blunt saws, of rats feasting in hospital tents. His words marched faster than any army, and they wounded the public's conscience deeper than any bullet could. For the first time, war was no longer distant. It was intimate. The people saw their soldiers starve, freeze, and die through the lens of the new invention, the camera. Fading photographs from Crimea showed real faces, not heroes from paintings, faces hollowed by disease and fear. The age of romantic warfare was over. Amid this reckoning, one woman's shadow stood taller than all generals: Florence Nightingale. Her lamplight had cut through the darkness of Scutari, but her fight did not end there. Back in London, she attacked the government's neglect with cold fury and endless data. Her reforms reshaped hospitals across the empire. She wrote, "The war was won not on the field, but in the wards." Medicine changed because of her. Sanitation became a science. Nursing became a profession. Compassion became strategy. Every soldier who lived because a nurse washed her hands owed his life to a war that should never have happened. In Russia, the shock was deeper but quieter. The loss had been humiliating, yet it tore open something necessary. Tsar Alexander II looked upon the shattered pride of his nation and chose a different kind of battle. "We must change," he said, "or perish." Within 5 years, he would free millions of serfs, an act that shook the empire more than any war. Railroads spread across Siberia, telegraph lines stitched cities together, and a new army rose from the ruins of the old. Defeat had become the forge of transformation, but not all scars healed. The veterans who returned home found little glory waiting. Many wandered the streets of London and Moscow with missing limbs, forgotten names, and haunted eyes. They were living monuments, reminders of how progress demanded flesh. And in the quiet homes of Europe, mothers read letters that had come too late. "We have taken the city," one ended, "but I cannot find myself in it." The wars of nations were written by kings and ended by clerks, but lived and died by men like him. The Crimean War had taught Europe its first modern lesson, that technology and empire could make killing efficient, but never clean. It had shown the world what it meant to die for strategy instead of purpose. And as the smoke cleared, one question remained, one that no treaty could answer. If this is what victory looks like, what does defeat mean? The Crimean War was not remembered for its victories, but for what it revealed. It was the first modern war, a clash fought not just with soldiers, but with steam, steel, and information. It marked the death of old Europe and the uneasy birth of a new one. In its aftermath, the great powers pretended to have learned restraint. But beneath the silence of treaties, a different kind of revolution had begun. The telegraph had connected capitals faster than generals could think. The railroad had moved men faster than they could march. And photography had turned war from glory into evidence. Every empire took note. For the first time, logistics mattered more than courage. Maps replaced intuition. Bureaucrats replaced heroes. A war that began with cavalry charges ended with supply lines, timetables, and statistics. "We fought with bayonets," a British officer wrote, "but lost to paperwork." In the offices of London and Paris, new departments were born. War offices, intelligence bureaus, medical boards. The machine of empire was learning how to repair itself. Russia learned too. Its defeat had stripped it bare, exposing centuries of stagnation. Alexander II's reforms, abolishing serfdom, modernizing the army, building new industries, were all born from the ashes of Sevastopol. The Tsar had lost a war, but in doing so had found a future. "We were beaten by time," he admitted. "Now we must learn to master it." The same war that shattered illusions also built foundations. From the mud of Crimea rose hospitals, rail networks, and organized armies. The chaos of the front line had forced invention, field telegraphs, trench layouts, standardized rations, and the first attempts at wartime journalism. The world had changed while Europe was too busy bleeding to notice. And yet, for all its lessons, humanity remained the same. Generals still measured worth in miles of land, not lives. Politicians spoke of balance and honor, while the veterans limped home to silence. The age of chivalry had ended, but the age of bureaucracy had begun, and with it came a colder kind of cruelty. In the salons of Paris, they toasted peace. In the slums of London, widows sold their husbands' medals for bread. The war had cost Britain and France fortunes, and the soldiers who survived became burdens instead of heroes. A nurse from Scutari wrote bitterly, "We won progress but lost our humanity." The Ottoman Empire, though victorious on paper, emerged hollowed. Its debt to France and Britain deepened, its dependence ensured. What had been a war for sovereignty had become a chain of obligation. The sick man of Europe had been kept alive, but only just. As for the Allies, their unity dissolved as quickly as the snow. Britain turned inward, France looked toward empire, and Sardinia dreamed of a united Italy. The alliance that had stormed Crimea now scattered to chase its own ambitions. The Peace of Paris was only a pause between storms. In the wreckage of Sevastopol, where melted bells and cannon scrap lay rusting together, a few Russian sailors carved words into a broken wall. "We were here." No flag remained, no glory survived, only proof that they had existed in a world learning, too late, how to make war eternal. The guns of Crimea had gone silent, but their echo stretched far beyond the Black Sea. Across Europe, the balance of power had shifted, subtly, permanently. The old world was cracking, and the empires that had bled for glory began to look inward, each nursing its own wound beneath the veneer of peace. For Britain, victory came at a price heavier than pride could bear. The war had cost more than 100,000 lives and emptied the treasury. Public anger forced a reckoning. Never again, Parliament swore. Yet new wars were already being planned in India and China. The empire had learned efficiency, not mercy. Still, reforms emerged in the shadow of loss. The army modernized. Sanitation became law. The press became a weapon more feared than any musket. It was the beginning of an age when truth itself could shape the battlefield. France, too, wore a crown of hollow triumph. Napoleon III had restored the glory his uncle once promised. But his victory had been borrowed, not earned. The French army returned in tatters, its hospitals full, its generals weary. Yet the emperor's ambitions only grew. The success in Crimea fed his hunger for prestige, driving him toward adventures in Mexico and Italy. The seeds of future humiliation had been planted in the ashes of Sevastopol. The Ottoman Empire, the war's supposed beneficiary, stood like a survivor rescued from a burning house. It had held its territory only because others had chosen to defend it. Modernization began under duress. New schools, new armies, new debts, but the cracks were widening. "Our empire is saved," one Ottoman official confessed, "but our soul is not." The Crimean alliance had kept the Sultan on his throne, but at the cost of sovereignty. The sick man of Europe had been bandaged, not cured. And then there was Russia, defeated, humiliated, but not destroyed. Alexander II's reforms began to reshape the empire with quiet ferocity. Serfdom, Russia's ancient chain, was broken. Railroads linked its frozen frontiers, and new industries rose along the rivers. "We are wounded," he told his ministers, "but a wounded bear still remembers its claws." The Tsar's modernization was not mercy. It was preparation. Within 20 years, Russian armies would march again, this time stronger, faster, and unbound by treaties signed in Paris. Meanwhile, in Sardinia, the smallest of the Allied victors, a new vision was born. Prime Minister Cavour had sent his troops to Crimea not for empire, but for recognition. They returned as heroes, and Italy's unification soon followed. From the blood of Sevastopol came the birth of a nation. Europe congratulated itself on a hard-won peace, but beneath the marble tables and polished speeches, the same rivalries smoldered. Britain feared Russia's recovery. France watched Prussia with growing suspicion. The Ottomans leaned on their allies like a crutch. Every empire claimed stability, yet each secretly prepared for the next storm. The Crimean War had not ended the dance of empires. It had only changed the tempo. Diplomacy replaced cannon fire, but the rhythm of ambition never stopped. In a letter written that year, a weary French officer summarized it best. "We fought to preserve peace, and in doing so, we taught the world how to destroy it better." Years passed, and the Crimea faded from memory, first from the newspapers, then from conversation, and finally from conscience. What had once been the center of the world's attention became a quiet shore again, where grass grew over trenches and children played among rusted cannon. The sea that had swallowed fleets now rolled in silence, carrying only the ghosts of empires. But though forgotten, the war's shadow stretched across generations. Every major power had learned something different from it, lessons that would shape the next century. Britain learned that industry, not courage, decided wars. France learned that glory could be manufactured as easily as propaganda. Russia learned that defeat could be the strongest weapon of all if it led to rebirth. The Ottoman Empire learned that survival did not mean strength. And Europe as a whole learned how to make war look civilized. It was the first conflict where the telegraph sent news faster than victory could travel. The first where photographers captured the faces of men before they died. The first where newspapers made the public the judge of generals. It had turned war from legend into spectacle, from sacrifice into bureaucracy. In doing so, it made humanity a witness and an accomplice. Historians would later call it a small war. But nothing about it was small to those who lived it. The battles of Alma, Balaclava, Inkerman, and Sevastopol had carved entire generations from Europe's heart. "We buried friends and found machines," one veteran wrote. "The world feels colder now." In Russia, the reforms begun by Alexander II transformed the empire. Railways, schools, and factories spread across the steppes. Yet the very modernization that saved Russia also fueled its imperial hunger. By the 1870s, its armies once again crossed into the Balkans, and Europe found itself facing the same crisis it thought it had ended in Crimea. The balance of power had survived, but only to be tested again. Elsewhere, the seeds of nationalism grew. Italian unification, spurred by Sardinia's role in the war, reshaped the continent. The idea of nationhood, once dismissed as fantasy, now marched in boots and uniforms. The Ottoman Empire, pressed from all sides, struggled to contain the fires that war had only delayed. The Balkans began to stir. And beneath all of this, a deeper transformation took hold. War itself had evolved. Telegraph lines hummed where banners once waved. Railroads carried supplies faster than strategy could keep up. The soldier's courage mattered less than the engineer's precision. What began in Crimea would echo at Sedan, at Verdun, and beyond. The 19th century had mechanized faith, and the 20th would mechanize death. For those who remembered, the war was not a story of heroes, but of patterns. "We built the future in blood," one aging officer wrote before his death, and when it came, it looked exactly as we left it. The Crimea had been the rehearsal, the first modern tragedy staged in full daylight. And when history raised the curtain again half a century later, the audience would find the same cast, the same ambitions, the same mistakes. Only the weapons had changed. The Treaty of Paris promised peace, but what it really gave was momentum. The world did not step away from war after Crimea. It stepped toward it. The same powers that swore never to repeat such waste began sharpening their ambitions anew. The guns had gone quiet, but the factories that fed them had not. Steam, iron, and pride kept working in silence. In the decades that followed, the old alliances unraveled and new ones took shape. Britain and France, once united by fear of Russia, grew suspicious of each other again. Austria, having stayed neutral and untrusted by all, found itself isolated, its empire rotting from within. And Russia, reborn from defeat, began watching the Balkans once more, where Slavic brothers waited for a savior. Europe's heart was a chessboard, and every peace treaty only rearranged the pieces. The lessons of Crimea echoed in the minds of generals and politicians alike. They saw that wars could be managed, reported, and justified, that a nation could bleed without collapsing, provided it bled efficiently. The press that had once exposed horrors now learned to shape them. The public that once demanded truth now demanded victory. And in that shift, modern warfare found its stage. From the ruins of Sevastopol came blueprints for a century. The telegraph became the nervous system of empires. Railroads became arteries of conquest. Trench warfare, once improvised in the mud of Crimea, became doctrine. The camera turned suffering into spectacle. The bureaucrat turned it into logistics. What had begun as an accident of pride became the prototype for industrial war. When Russia returned to the Balkans in 1877, it did so under the same banner: liberation, justice, destiny. The same words that had drowned the world once before. The Ottoman Empire, weaker and cornered, fell back again. And the Balkans, scarred by centuries of empire, began to fracture. Out of those fractures would one day come the spark that ignited the First World War. The shot fired in Sarajevo by a young man whose grandparents had lived under the same treaties signed in Paris. It is easy to trace a straight line from Crimea's smoke to the trenches of 1914. Both wars began in confusion, both justified by pride, and both fought by men who never knew why. The uniforms changed, the weapons improved, but the motive stayed the same: empire pretending to be honor. When historians look back, they often call Crimea a small war. But small wars are not forgotten because of their scale. They are forgotten because their warnings go unheeded. Crimea was the first domino. When it fell, the rest were waiting. In a London archive, one can still read a letter from a British officer written in 1856. "We leave this place thinking we have ended something, but perhaps we have only begun it." He was right. The thunder of cannons over Sevastopol was not an ending. It was the overture. The century that followed would prove it, note by note, until the world itself drowned in its echo. Long after the treaties were signed and the flags taken down, the wind over Crimea kept whispering. It moved through the ruins of Sevastopol, through the empty gun pits, through the graves where names had already faded. Grass grew over the trenches. The sea, once black with smoke and iron, rolled again in blue silence. But beneath it, the bones of men and ships still slept, side by side. The world had moved on, as it always does. New wars rose, new heroes fell, and the Crimean War sank beneath their weight, remembered only by historians and widows. Yet its echoes remained everywhere, in the telegraph lines that circled the globe, in the hospitals that bore Florence Nightingale's shadow, in the iron rails that carried armies faster than compassion could follow. For the survivors, peace brought no comfort. They returned home changed, not in body, but in soul. Many spoke little, some could not speak at all. "We left part of ourselves on those hills," one British veteran wrote. "Not buried, just waiting. Their medals tarnished, their memories did not." In Russia, the reforms that followed the war reshaped an empire, but also set it on a collision course with the future. The Tsar who had freed the serfs would one day be killed by his own people, victim of the very awakening he had unleashed. In Britain, the machinery of empire rolled on, faster and colder. In France, Napoleon III's star flared and fell. The Ottoman Empire staggered forward for half a century more, dying in slow motion. The alliances born from Crimea dissolved into rivalries that would one day devour the continent. And yet, amid all that ruin, a strange kind of progress survived. The nurses who learned in Scutari taught the next generation. The engineers who built the Crimean Railway carried that knowledge into a new industrial age. The photographers who captured the faces of dying soldiers gave birth to modern journalism. Out of suffering came method. Out of chaos came order. Out of war came the illusion that humanity could control its own destruction. But time has a way of erasing what it wishes us to forget. The Crimean War became a footnote, its names fading into the dust of greater tragedies: Verdun, Stalingrad, Hiroshima. Yet without Crimea, none of those would have been possible. It was the blueprint, the rehearsal, the moment when war stopped being personal and became procedural. If you stand today on the cliffs above the Black Sea, you can still feel the wind that once carried the roar of cannon. You can see the same horizon those men saw, the same light on the water, the same sky that watched them die. Nothing moves now except the grass. Nothing speaks but the sea. History calls it a forgotten war. But wars are never forgotten. They only wait, sleeping beneath new names, until the world remembers them again. And so the Crimea remains, quiet but not at peace, a grave made of stone and memory. Its story ended long ago, yet the silence it left behind is still teaching us what thunder never could.